Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the second day of Psychedelic Intersections. I am, as you heard yesterday, Jeffrey Breau, the program lead here for the Psychedelics and Spirituality Initiative at the Center for the Study of World Religions, and I am fiddling with Zoom. There we go, great. Today the morning will be two panels, one here and one in the other room. This is on contemporary spiritualities, psychedelic spiritualities panel, and we have four great speakers. Unfortunately, our second speaker, Jonathan David, was unable to be here in person, so we'll be presenting on Zoom. Without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. And I will note, we noted this yesterday, but we're just reading short bios, so you don't have to hear me speak too much. But if you want to learn more about our speakers, their full bios and links to their personal websites are in our program and on the website, the conference website. Okay, our first speaker is going to be Michelle Bentsman. Michelle is a PhD candidate in the Committee on the Study of Religion at Harvard University. Welcome, Michelle.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, and it's wonderful to be with you on this clear and cloudless day. I really enjoy that on my way over. And I'll be talking about Shipibo medicine songs and ayahuasca ceremonies this morning for non-Westerners. And I'll be talking about a little bit about what it means to be a plant doctor that is channeled through song. So first, I'd like to situate myself and my work and who I work with. I work with a family of Shipibo healers in the Amazon that's in Peru. So it's the Western Amazon. It's in the northeast of Peru. And the Shipibo have historically been settled along the Ucayali River. So that's in pinkish purple over there in that image. And the Shipibo is usually a shorthand actually for three indigenous groups. That's the Shipibo, the Conibo, and the Shipibo. And those three indigenous groups came together at the beginning of the Spanish missionization period. And that was a time of a lot of violence and epidemic illness. So in order to not go extinct, they banded together. And so that is always integral in the word Shipibo when I say it. And now the Shipibo are renowned for their mastery of plant medicine and often sought out for ayahuasca ceremonies. Oops. So this is me with my teachers. This is Enrique Lopez and this is Rono Lopez. They're brothers. I've been working with them at their camps. Mokonate is Rono's camp and Keston Rono is Enrique's camp. And I've been working with them since 2018. I go there about yearly and I started going for my own healing. And it's also become something that felt important to fold into my research. So I'm situating myself as a scholar practitioner in this field. I also have been assisting ceremonies with communities in upstate New York since 2019, and I'm on the board of a Shipibo trained temple up there. So very much interested in how practitioner ethics also unfold. And what I've learned on the ground about plant medicine really comes from Enrique and Rono. And I just want to note that even between the two brothers, there's a lot of differences in belief and practice. So I can't really speak for them. I also am not a substitute for Shipibo voices. I am a white US-based non-Indigenous practitioner researcher, and it's been truly an honor to hear Indigenous voices at this conference that I'm so honored to learn from, and I hope to keep listening. And it feels really vital to me to be able to uplift and share the teachings of Enrique and Rono as they share it with us. And they share it with us with a lot of generosity, and they encourage us to bring this to our communities, to our countries. And they say that we need a lot of healing. Rono is like, we're very contaminated. That's one thing that he has said to us very directly. He says, you're very contaminated, you need this. So I share that with that ethos in mind. So the foundational premises of my talk today, situated at this intersection between plant medicine and a Western paradigm by being here, a pharmaceutical, psychedelic, biomedical paradigm. I want to talk about, first, the Shipibo having a tradition of establishing direct plant relationships with their medicine plants for healing. These medical plants are regarded as teachers, as masters, as gods, and they accomplish healing actually through song. And these healing practices introduce critical points of contrast with Western medical paradigms that I'd like to touch on. So within the Shipibo worldview, medicinal plants are referred to as Rao. So these are plants that are really good to establish a connection with. These are plants that have a lot of wisdom, they have a lot of mastery, and so it's good to open up a connection with these plants. And the way that's done is a process called sama. That's a dieta process, and during that process, the connection with the plant is opened, a relationship is opened, a contract is spiritually opened, and then that connection is strengthened, and it's usually strengthened through things like fasting, meditating, really opening and weakening the body in order to become receptive to the very subtle communications that come through with the plant. And then once that connection is really anchored, that becomes a resource for healers to bring those energies into ceremony in order to work on patients. So I'd like to share a short video of Rono speaking about this. So in that video, Rono is speaking into really trusting and really having faith in the plants. And that's because of everything that the plants are able to do. So in this vein, the medicine plants, they are teachers, they are masters, they're doctors, they're gods, they're people, and they really carry ancient healing wisdom. They're referred to as Mariah, and Mariah is considered the ancient healers of old. Some Shipibo will understand that the Mariahs no longer exist. Others will empower Mariahs in this generation. And they really can guide us in alignment with personal and collective healing. And the ayahuasca is a means of opening up these cross-species connections. In Quechua, this is spirit vine is the translation, and in Shipibo, this is referred to as the serpent vine, or as oni, directly as wisdom. My understanding has been that ayahuasca is really a bridge. It's a stage. It's what allows these connections to happen. It's tapping into a spiritual reality that is pre-existing, but then becomes manifest through this opening of the medicine. So it's really creating those connections. And within the Shipibo cosmology, Ronin is very central. The Ronin is understood as the primordial anaconda. It's the mother of the plants. It's the mother of the waters, and according to some Shipibo Kanibo songs, the anaconda actually looked at its own skin and saw the patterns that were contained therein and was able to sing the world into being through the patterns on its own skin, breathing existence in that way. I'd like to share an ikaro that Rono has shared with us. Don Rono's name actually means snake. Enrique's Shipibo name also means snake, Kesten Rono. And this is a traditional Shipibo ikaro. And it is translated as follows. In front of the waters of the anaconda, my kingfisher pierces the water. Anaconda inside my stomach, I invite your offering to open the world of ayahuasca. I am not afraid. And so this song is really functioning on a few levels at once. The person who is singing is apprehending the waters of the anaconda in front of them. And that is a reference to the primordial anaconda of Ronin, to the watery creative underworld that ayahuasca gives access to, but it's also a reference to the brew itself. So the brew of ayahuasca is understood as a snake vine. So by standing in front of the waters or sitting in front of the waters of the anaconda, one is actually speaking into one's own stomach while also apprehending the reality that's opening up in front of them and entering into the medicine. And in this song, the kingfisher is called upon. So if you'll notice, the kingfisher has a long, piercing beak. And this is really important because this is how the kingfisher establishes its hunting. And so this is actually understood as a transfer of power of Ronin to the singer. The singer is using this kingfisher's piercing power through the voice in order to bring the power of Ronin into themselves. So one of the things that is important to understand about this journey is that it was previously not open to all patients to be taking ayahuasca. Previously, this is something that only healing specialists would do, and it was considered to be something that was very specialized work and quite dangerous. So in this sense, being able to take on the courage of Ronin actually gives a lot of capacity to be able to navigate these realms. And the way that this navigation works is that these spirit allies that have been cultivated with through dieta are summoned through the voice. The voice becomes the spirit's body, and it becomes the acoustic flesh of these spirits. That sonic materiality ontologically becomes something that these spirits can really be enrobed within, and that's how they enter into the space. The way that my mentor Bernd Brebeck talks about it, he calls it enchanted listening, when one is able to actually hear what's going on. And this is a tapping into of really unhearable dimensions of reality. And they are beyond the physical realm, and yet they are manifesting through sound itself. So this is different from thinking about what Brebeck would call indexical listening. So if I speak in a certain way, you can hear the echoes of my voice across the room, right? You have a sense of this space. That's indexical listening. When I share these ideas with you, you begin to have a cognitive understanding. That's a structural listening. But this is something completely different. This is what they call a purely auditory ontology. The sound itself has a sonic potency, and the spirits can enter into that sonic potency and have real agency to act on patients, on the room, on what is happening. So that brings me to the title of my talk, which is They Say That I Am Singing, right? And that is in Shipibo said as Eronki Bewai. And that is a poetic way of saying the spirits are really the ones that are singing through me. And this is a very traditional way to start an ikaro, a medicine song, because it establishes a structure of authority about what's actually going on within the song. What's actually happening is that the plant spirits are the ones who are being called upon, who are being connected to, and they are the ones who are doing the work. The human healers are merely the vessels for something else beyond us to happen. And here are a couple examples. These are Dos Maestros from the Temple of the Way of Light, and they are demonstrating some of their ikaros, and they are both starting this way, and these are for demonstrative purposes. Ceremonies usually happen at night, so they're just demonstrating here. That's Maestra Diogenes, and this is Doña Olivia Arevalo. And in both of these examples, they are repeating Eya ronki bewai. And often things are repeated within Shipibo song structures because it takes a while for things to fully land. It's not, you don't just say it once and it happens. Right? It takes a while for us to settle in. It takes a while for us to settle into the room and become present. It takes a while for actions in song to really fully materialize. So you say again and again until you really know that it's happened. They are singing. They say that I am singing. So here's a painting by the Shipibo artist Chonon Bencho. And I love this painting because it also represents a triadic structure of how this relationship works, how this healing relationship works. So at the top, you have the master plant spirit in her human embodiment in the trees. And then below, you have what may be to healer initiates or to Shipibo folks in traditional garb. And one is acting as the healer and giving a treatment with tobacco smoke. To another. And although it may not look like it may look like this is just someone smoking their tobacco pipe at someone else, this is actually a vocal technique. And the vocal technique is called Koshering. And what happens here is that the song or the prayer, the intention, it gets sung or whistled into the tobacco itself, and then that tobacco is lit and blown over another person as a treatment. This can also be done with perfume or just with air. And so the song actually absorbs into the substance, and then the substance absorbs into the person. And of course, this establishes a hierarchy in which the plants are the ones who are overseeing things, giving the wisdom, giving the information, and healing, which is quite different from our Western medical paradigm where the doctor is the ultimate authority. And there's really this dyadic vertical structure. This is not that. This is a triangle. So to continue to talk about some of the differences between these two paradigms. So as I mentioned before, the healer will take the medicine traditionally to treat a patient. And so that's a way of performing a diagnostic. The medicine opens up the connections to the plants, it opens up the worlds, and then that healer is able to access an understanding of what's really going on with a patient through the wisdom and the insight of the plants. And in the last century, of course, that has opened up to, because of a Western encounter, has opened up to a different evolution where everybody takes the medicine. And in a Western medical model, we have something very different. We have a doctor prescribing often a pharmaceutical, and that is something that the patient will take. It's something that's understood as a substance with some active compounds and usually has no more agency than that. And it would be very strange for the doctor to take the pills that they prescribe to their patient. It would be strange. So that doesn't happen. But there's a real inversion here of who is the real doctor. Also, there's a real contrast in terms of how pain is approached. So when ingesting ayahuasca, there is an expectation that pain is very likely to happen in some form. Purgation is very likely to happen in some form. Discomfort is something that is normal. Maybe that's vomiting, maybe that's weeping, maybe that's shivering. All sorts of things can happen, and they don't have to happen. But in a pharmaceutical paradigm, there's an expectation of painlessness, and that really emerges in the 1840s with the birth of anesthesia and creates a wonderful amount of possibility for pharmaceuticals to have ballooned in the way that they have, in many ways being of great service to us, and also for surgery to become a very widespread thing that is done in medicine. And this also creates an understanding of surgeons as really being godlike in what they do. They cut open people's bodies, they go inside of us, and they are expected to have machine-like precision. They have to have machine-like precision. And so this is actually where the two paradigms might almost meet, because the surgeon is a more than human figure, a machine-like God in so many senses, and that's implicit in how we operate in our culture. And meanwhile, in the Shipibo medicine song paradigm, there is an access to more than human worlds. literally calling upon more than humans to work through us. And these two paradigms that blew up in Western medicine, using pharmaceuticals and really relying on substances, as well as the rise of surgery and surgeons, both of these are concepts that are applied in a sort of, almost I want to say blurry or loose way in order to make sense of what is happening in Shipibo medicine songs. So as substances, as I noted earlier, you can blow into a substance and let that substance absorb into someone with smoke or water or air. But the sound itself is ontologically a substance. So when you sing to someone, even when you're done singing, there's an understanding that that song can linger inside of the person for as long as it needs to linger. That medicine is working on you whether you know it or not, and it will keep working until it's done doing what it needs to do. So the song is itself an ontological substance. And along with that, Enrique and other healers will refer to the plants as God's pharmacy. And that's really vital for people that don't have access to Western medicine. But if Shipibos do have access, they'll go with both if they can. They'll get the really clear diagnostic imaging tests that they need from Western medicines, and they'll sit in ceremony, because ceremony can address subtle energies and holistic fields that pharmaceuticals and surgeries often cannot. And as surgeries, as Baron puts it, the voice can enter a patient's body and operate on it like a surgeon's scalpel. And this is attested into how the Shipibos themselves talk about song. They'll say, I was pierced by the voice or the word. I was pierced by the song. And that brings us back to that kingfisher and that beak that is used to hunt and then can penetrate into the medicine itself. And I'd like to close with a quote from my friend and mentor, Shawan, who's a Venezuelan shaman that's been an apprentice with the Shipibo for many years. And this is what he says: the medicine itself is the singing. So that's the carrier of that medicine. We recognize our familiarity with what we call gods, angels, the spirits of the animals, the spirits of the plants. Icaros, medicine songs, build upon this. The beauty, the color, the dynamics, the love, those are your tools. You don't have a cutting knife, but then you call the Pino, the hummingbird, with the Sheta, that's its toothy beak, to operate, to decorate, like a surgeon. So I just want to close by saying that being immersed in this worldview has really opened up an epistemic humility for me, that real transformation and real change is really possible, as well as the understanding that the plants have been here long before us and created space for us. And in a real sense, they are truly our elders, and we can connect with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That generated a lot of questions for me, and if it generated questions for those of you out in the audience, we'll have lots of time for Q&A at the end, so please write them down. I'm going to set up Jonathan David, who's presenting on Zoom, but if people want to move to a place where they can see the slides while I do that, you're welcome to. When we have presenters in person, I'm going to leave this monitor off due to the room setup causing early blindness. Okay, let me. So Jonathan, I don't know if you can hear me, but you're welcome to come on screen and start sharing your screen if you're there. Great, I can see your slides.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
And I'm just.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay, that's great.
Perfect. All right, I'm going to turn up the volume slightly. Great. So our next speaker is Jonathan David. Jonathan David is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Exeter, UK. Take it away, Jonathan.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Jonathan David. I'm a psychologist and postdoc researcher at the University of Exeter, where I work with Leo Rosman. My academic background is in ayahuasca research. I did my PhD in neuroscience and psychology on how ayahuasca impacts human death perception. And today I would like to present you my correct work, which explores ayahuasca within Ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. Unfortunately, I could not attend to the conference in person because I'm in Israel now and doing this study, a part of the study, and my flight was canceled because of the war. I really want to express my hope and prayers for better days and peace ahead. So let me briefly outline what I'm going to cover today. First, I will introduce the Ultra-Orthodox, which are also called the Haredi. I will call them the Haredi today. Then I will show you what happens when Haredi people drink ayahuasca, based on a qualitative study I conducted in Israel and the United States. First, I will show you how the setting looked like, how Haredi setting looked like. Then the participants, who are Haredi who drink ayahuasca and why they do that. Then the phenomenology, what do they experience? And then post-ayahuasca change, how it impacts their religious life. And finally, what religious tensions they face with ayahuasca and what are the solutions they found to face those tensions, to navigate those tensions. So who are the Haredi? The Haredi are a Jewish group that emerged in the 18th century in Europe as a reaction to modernization and the secularization of Jewish life in Europe. Their aim was to protect Judaism by preserving tradition as strictly as possible and by resisting any change brought by modern society. For Haredi Jews, religion's rules shape nearly every aspect of their life, including what they eat, what they wear, when they engage in intimate activities, and even the order they put their shoes every morning. It's important to emphasize that the Haredi are very diverse. There are three main groups, Hasidic, Sephardic, and Litvak, and more than 100 substreams. So in the recent years, as part of the psychedelic renaissance, psychedelics have started to make their own way to those Haredi enclaves in the United States and Israel, which it seemed very surprising because the Haredi are considered very conservative, particularly on areas like illegal drug use. So I want to share a brief video of rabbis, religious authorities answering religious questions on psychedelics. They are called rabbis for the medicine, and you can scan the QR if you want to see the full video, and please let me hear if you can hear my video.
The first question that was sent is as follows: is this something that should be used only for mental health reasons, or is it something people should use for spiritual growth? Okay, is this, first of all, we have to define this. Okay, this means psychedelics in general. Psychedelics is a big term. It includes mushrooms, it includes ayahuasca, it includes wachuma, it includes bufo, it includes ketamine, maybe, it includes sassafras kana. There's some others that people never heard of. There's yopo, there's all different kinds of psychedelics. All of them.
Does it include breathwork?
So it really looked like those rabbis know exactly what they're talking about. And the question is, what do we know about psychedelics in this community, in the Haredi community? And the answer is very little. There's no published empirical research on this topic. We don't know nothing about their motivation, about the phenomenology, the experience, the long-term effects. And more broadly, psychedelics in very conservative religious contexts like the Haredi are unstudied. So most of the research comes from secular population where psychedelics are usually associated with more liberal social world and with experiences of openness, freedom, personal liberation, ego dissolution, and so on. This is, of course, in the West. And the question is, how does highly regulated religious system adopt and adapt to psychedelics? How the Haredi do it? Do they embrace it? Do they reject it? Do they resist to it, as they do with many other modern technologies? For example, they fight against the internet, smartphones, social media, and so on. So this is some of the questions my study tried to answer. So about the study, the aim was to explore Haredi ayahuasca use. I did it through in-depth semi-structural interviews with Haredi people from Israel and the United States. I did field observation in Haredi ceremonies, and I will show you what it is exactly. And I also analyzed religious texts related to ayahuasca. In the end, the sample included 23 participants, half from Israel and half from the United States, and the data analysis was done in a thematic analysis by Brown and Clark. So about the setting. So we found at least 4 ayahuasca ceremonies that are adapted for the Haredi community, 3 in the United States and 1 in Israel. Those ceremonies blend ayahuasca elements with Jewish rituals in different ways. On one end of the spectrum, you will find ceremonies that are almost totally, entirely Jewish. You will hear Haredi Jewish music, chanting prayers in Yiddish or in Hebrew, and you will see Jewish symbols in the space and Jewish practices, such as blowing the shofar, the ram horn Jewish people blow on holidays, or lighting Hanukkah candles in the ceremony. At the other end of the spectrum, there are ceremonies that are much more neo-shamanic in style or eclectic, blending Judaism with indigenous shamanic practices, music, and atmosphere. Regarding the facilitators are Haredi or formally Haredi, and the ceremonies are led or approved by rabbis. Here is another video of a ceremony I observed in Israel. In this clip, participants are chanting a Jewish prayer of thanksgiving God, Kol Hanshama Te'Hallelujah. So other interesting facts on those ceremonies is that some of the Haredi also attend typical normal ceremonies, non-Haredi ceremonies, and some indigenous shamans from the Amazon are traveling to the United States, to the Haredi enclaves, serving ayahuasca and teaching them how to practice ayahuasca. And as Michelle said, they say we need a lot of healing, and they offer healing for this community. One interesting feature of those ceremonies is that mixed gender setting is common. This is very unusual in Haredi context, where gender separation is typically very, very strict, including, for example, weddings that are separated. Some facilitators offer single gender ceremonies for those who prefer single gender ceremonies, and I will return to this issue of mixed gender later when I will discuss the conflicts Haredi people face with the practice of ayahuasca. So regarding the participants, who are the participants and why they use ayahuasca? Most of them come from the mainstream segments of the Haredi society, from Litvak and Hasidic stream, not from fringe groups. Their explicit motivation is therapeutic, mainly therapeutic, healing from trauma, from PTSD, from depression, so on. But also many people mentioned curiosity. It's important to note that Judaism don't have a formal tradition on psychedelics, and therefore psychedelics are not banned automatically for Haredi people, because usually things are banned automatically, new things. And here I would like to share a psak halacha, a religious ruling of a well-respected rabbi, a head of a rabbinical court, which in this ruling is said that ayahuasca is generally not permitted religiously, but it may be allowed if it's recommended by a medical profession. This also suggests that ayahuasca had spread enough within the Haredi world to require a formal rabbinic response. I also want to thank here to Noah Feldman from Harvard for sharing me this religious ruling, sharing with me. Okay, so now I want to show you the phenomenology of the ayahuasca experience. So the Haredi experience parallels border reports, people seeing visions, they have encounters with entities, they have death-related experiences, emotional breakthrough, childhood regression, and many other experiences they consider to be very healing.
Therapy, massage, qigong, astrology, like past life regressions.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it's near Woodstock.
Uh-huh.
Which is kind of like that area. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, can I continue? Can you hear me, Jeff?
Sorry, David. We just got a little taste of someone's psychedelic therapy. You're back to you.
Okay. So I was talking on the phenomenology, and so I said Haredi people experience ayahuasca as everyone else, but at the same time, Jewish experiences emerged. So now I want to show you the Jewish phenomenology. I will show you that in the map of themes and sub-themes. The first theme is Jewish mystical and visionary experiences. You can see how frequent those experiences were mentioned by our participants. And those include experiences related to the Bet HaMikdash, the Jewish temple that was destroyed 2,000 years ago, experiences related to Jewish entities, experiences related to the divine, but in Jewish terms, like Ruach HaKodesh, Shechina, experiences related with Neshama, the soul, experiences of Jewish prayer and Jewish text and Hebrew letters, experiences related to prophecy and eschatological experiences, of course, in Jewish terms, and collective Jewish spirituality and insights about Judaism, Jewish insights. Another theme is the experiences of religious tensions. And you can see that it's much less prevalent, and it includes questioning about halakha, Jewish law, and questioning about God, religious conflicts, feeling that someone is doing something prohibited, and doing prohibited religious behaviors. For example, women taking off traditional head covering. So I will give you some examples. The first example is related to Bet HaMikdash, the Jewish temple. One participant from Israel said, in ayahuasca, we experienced something like a mishkan, a tabernacle, like a small Bet HaMikdash, the temple. The candles, you experience them as the temple menorah. The incense, it's like the incense in the temple, the singing of the Levitas. And there was a feeling like the Shekhinah, the divine, is with us, the creator is with us, like one experience in the temple. Related to Jewish entities, I will give you another example. So mainly participants reported experiences involving Jewish ancestors or biblical figures from the Hebrew Bible, such as seeing or experiencing Abraham, Isaac, Sarah, David, King David, King Solomon, and so on. Here is an ayahuasca experience of one participant who described an encounter with Rabbi Nachman from Breslev, who died in the 1810. So he said, I saw Rabbi Nachman. I had never seen him before. I hadn't studied his book. He wasn't my rabbi at all. Suddenly, he appeared to me very vivid way. He held my hand, I shook his hand, and he told me that I would merit a long life, that I would find a shidduch, a match soon, and that in the end, everything will work the best for me. Regarding acute religious conflicts and tensions, one man from Israel said, something in the Jewish instinct that oppose idolatry suddenly awaked in me. I said to myself, wait, what's going on here? They are singing to ayahuasca and there is a Mother Earth. I will discuss more on this tension with idolatry in the end of the talk. So now I want to show you the long-term effect of ayahuasca on Haredi participants, which include improvements in mental health, in well-being. They say that their ayahuasca is doing life-changing experiences, also challenging experiences. And in general, again, they find it very therapeutic. But here I will focus on the long-term effects on participants' religiosity. So I will show you the themes and the sub-themes again. The first theme is the change in religious experience, spirituality, and belief, usually involving a deeper faith and more personal connection to God and Judaism, strengthened belief and rediscovery of the truth of Judaism, deepened relationship with God, novel understanding of Judaism, and a shift toward more experiential spirituality and less obligated-based religiosity. The second theme is change in religious behavior, which varied among participants. Some participants mentioned that ayahuasca increased their religious behavior, while others said that it reduced their religious behavior. They become starting practicing by choice, and it may make them to rely less on rabbis, on religious authorities. So I will give you some examples. The first example is from a woman from Israel who said, I always felt connected to Judaism. I was born with that feeling. But ayahuasca strengthened it, sharpened it, and made that faith clearer and stronger. Regarding increase in religious behavior, one said, since ayahuasca, I go to minyanim, good prayers, more often. And regarding less religious behavior, so one woman from Israel said, I started to loosen a bit the boundaries of my halachic framework, my religious framework. I've been in this process with ayahuasca for 7 years, and I can say that during this time, my halachic framework has become less rigid, more flexible and lighter, but I'm still committed. So now I want to show you the tensions, the religious tensions those participants face with ayahuasca, the participants and the rabbis, the religious authorities. You can see how frequent people mention tensions. So the first tension has to do with the foreignness of ayahuasca and the lack of tradition surrounding it. For Haredi participants, everyday practices are expected to come from Jewish tradition and halakha. Ayahuasca doesn't come from that world. It's a Phrygian shamanic practice from the Amazon, and it created tensions for participants and their identity. The second theme has to do with idolatry and the meeting point between Amazonian and Jewish cosmologies. In Haredi Judaism, belief in one God is absolute, and any connection to other spiritual power, practices, or religious world is forbidden. Idolatry is considered one of the most serious sins in Judaism, and this issue is especially sensitive. Since ayahuasca is indigenous, is connected to indigenous spiritual tradition, it is an indigenous spiritual tradition. It includes practices related to spirits, animistic ideas, and so on. It created a strong idolatry-related tension for participants and religious authorities. The third tension is related to mixed gender participation. In Haredi life, there is a strong separation between men and women from early age, and mixed spaces are very, very limited. Ayahuasca ceremonies, especially neo-shamanic one, involve men and women taking part together in intimate and emotionally space, and this created a significant tension for participants and religious authorities. There are many other tensions, but unfortunately, I don't have enough time for everything. So I want to give you now some examples related to foreignness and lack of tradition. So one man said, "I never felt like I was doing something Jewish. It's not part of my tradition. It doesn't really fit my tradition, the tradition." Another example is one male from the United States who said, "This is not my way of life. I'm not a medicine person. I'm a Jewish person. I follow the Torah. That's it. This ayahuasca is a mikveh, by chance. Things that happen in Galus, in exile. Things that happen because we don't have Bet HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. If we had Bet HaMikdash, I would go there for such an experience." So now an example of the tension, of the cosmological tension of the meeting point between Amazonian and Jewish cosmology. And one man said, "Shamanism, after all, is not something Jewish. It's come from the Amazonian tribes. And usually they bring in elements of idolatry and things like that." Other examples are that some participants and rabbi mentioned that attributing spiritual agency to ayahuasca, for example, calling it Mother Ayahuasca or Grandmother, as some indigenous people do, is problematic for them as in terms of idolatry. Other problems also exist in the indigenous cosmological language. For example, calling Pachamama, Mother Earth, indigenous tradition is very problematic for the Haredi people because of the risk of idolatry. And finally, related to mixed gender participation, as one woman said, that's the big trigger. So how they address those religious tensions, what are the solutions they found? There are many, I will show you some of them. So the first solution is by framing ayahuasca as a medicine. By framing ayahuasca as a medicine, it becomes possible to allow more flexibility in religious rules and halacha. This is based on a familiar idea in Judaism and the Haredi world, that in case of medical rules, and in case of medical need, the rules change. And this makes easier to reduce concerns about religious boundaries, tradition, and mixed gender participation. The second strategy is a religious regulation of ayahuasca, what I call koshering ayahuasca. This regulation takes place on three levels: the setting, and the experience itself. So an example of regulation of the set is that rabbis guided participants, for example, toward the right religiosity-based mindset and healing intention before the ceremony. An example of regulation, the setting, is that the ritual environment has adapted to fit the Haredi norms, as I mentioned before. In some cases, this also involves a rabbinical approval of a specific ceremony. I will show you an example for it. And finally, the last example, regulating the experience, related to regulating, koshering the experience or regulating the experience, has to do with, for example, that participants receive rabbinical guidance not to ask things or communicate with certain entities during the experience. And instead of connecting to those entities, people need to direct the intention to God, attention to God, and in order to prevent idolatry or other religious problems. Of course, I have many other religious solutions, but I will not go into them. So I'll give you one example of one male from the United States who said, there is a rabbi who make kosher the ceremony. He's very strict guidelines. He makes sure that there is no woman singing and makes sure that there is no aspect of idolatry in the ceremony. So in summary, Haredi are using ayahuasca. That's driven by people from the mainstream. There is a Jewish phenomenology. People experience ayahuasca in Jewish terms, not only. And there is a long-term effect also appear to exist, mainly in form of increased feeling, connection, and spirituality of Judaism. And however, effects on behavior are less consistent. And for some, it increased religious behavior, while others, it decreased their religious behavior. Tensions and solutions exist. And looking ahead, I'm beginning now a quantitative study aimed to replicate those findings in a larger sample and address also some of the open questions of this study, mainly related to religious behaviors, and also the limitation of the study, which is qualitative and exploratory. Okay, so this is the last slide. What can all this teach us? I think, first of all, psychedelics and ayahuasca are context dependent and come with inbuilt cultural plasticity, as Langlitz say. And maybe here we can add also a religious plasticity. Finally, the fusion of psychedelics across culture, mainly in closed Orthodox religious cultures like the Haredi, is an ongoing active process of negotiation. And the spread of ayahuasca and psychedelics into the Haredi enclaves remains to be seen. Time will say if they will do an integration, if they will reject it to try to fight it as they do with many other technologies. Maybe we will see the emergence of new Haredi substreams. Only time will say. I want to say thank you to Leo Rosman, my supervisor, Aviv Berkovich-Ohana, all the rest of the team. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you for being willing to join us on Zoom late in your day. We'll see you back for the Q&A. Oop, I don't want to share, I want to present. 1 second, I just need to share this with our Zoom folks.
Sharing.
What's that?
Sharing is good.
Sharing is good, yeah.
Virtue I learned in kindergarten.
Yeah, we're putting it in action. Wonderful. Let's see. Let me minimize that. I'm also going to turn off this for the folks sitting in the front here. I'm going to turn off this projector so that Gordon can see. So if you want to move to be able to see his slides, you're welcome to. Our next speaker is J. Gordon Melton, who is a distinguished professor of American religious history at Baylor University. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you. Since the turn of the century, we have seen a marked revival of churches that use entheogenic substances as they expand around. Turn that a little bit down. There you go. All right. Expand around the country. I and several colleagues have been trying to map out and get some statistics on these groups. We have found about 200 of them. With one exception, they are all relatively small groups, locally based, one center of activity. A few have multiple centers of activity, one or two in different metropolitan areas around the country. We have also noticed, among other activities, is that there is a significant lack of literature describing the beliefs and practices of these groups. As a matter of fact, if you gather all of the literature about these 200 groups, it will fill one shelf of a tiny book stand. It's almost non-existent. Therefore, in order to try to understand what these groups are believing and teaching and practicing, we turn to their web pages. And on the web pages, among other things, you find that most of the groups, a little over 100 of them, have published a statement of belief in imitation of Christian creeds and articles of religion. And they tell us a good deal about what is going on. It also lets us know that what we're dealing with in terms of the founders of these groups. Overwhelmingly, the founder of the entheogenic groups have no formal theological training of any kind, and generally have left a religion behind them in order to become a part of this new and very different religion. In order to operate and create these new religions, and one of the reasons they remain relatively small is they've had to operate in a rather hostile environment. Their communities tend to be unstable to some extent because of the cultural pressure, both criticism from the more dominant religious community and from actual interference and attacks from various government agencies. Our attempt to understand the new ethnogenic and theogenic religions begins with how they fit into the larger American state. Now, is this the... There we go.
It's the...
Okay.
No, not that one.
This one. Yep. All right. It's how they fit into the larger religious landscape. Since the passing of the new Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, American religion has undergone a radical restructuring. That reordering of things spiritual was led by the arrival of Christianity as the faith of the majority of Americans. As you can see here, this is there are three lines in this chart. The bottom line is atheism. Atheism has, from whenever we've begun to measure it, been a steady 4.5% of the population. It has not grown or declined during that era. It's grown in numbers because the population has grown. But, and it's finally reached a point where it can have national organizations. There are now 7 national atheist organizations, organizations of the religiously irreligious. But they remain that bottom green line, as you will see. The top line is population, as the population growth, and the red line is Christianity and its growth. You can see at the beginning of the Republic, Christians were about 10-15% of the population. Great majority of the Americans in the beginning of the 19th century and through the 19th century were not members of any religious organization. They were a fairly irreligious bunch, in spite of our myths about how religion affected the growth of the country. They began growing in the middle of the 19th century, and by the end of the 19th century, were about a third of the population. In terms of this, also, the number of denominations began to grow. At the beginning, we had about 20 denominations, and most of those you would know. They're the Presbyterians, Lutheran, Methodist, et cetera, that grew large. By 1900, we had 350 denominations. By 1965, when the new immigration law was passed, we had about 800. Today, we have 2,500 denominations, overwhelmingly small and regional in nature, but they have contributed to the fragmentation of religion. And the part we know about is the decline of the larger churches in many cases, and the arrival of new churches on the largest religious group list in the United States. Now, here's the way religion has grown in the country more recently, since 1950. In 1942 is the year 50% of Americans finally became Christians. And what we've seen, the change we've seen is that while Christianity has always been the majority religion in the United States, it was only in the 1940s, during World War II, that half of the people became Christians, and we could say that in 1943, 51% were Christians, and of course there was in the 50s one of those spurts of revival. Today, Christianity has finally reached close to 70% of the population, and so Christianity now has a supermajority, and that's very important. But the other thing that's happened is that while in most of the American history, Christianity had no significant competitors. The only competing religious group was the Jewish community, which is around 2% of the population. At the time of the founding, there were 6 Jewish congregations in the country. In the 1780s, they jumped up to about 2% during the 1880s and remained at that rate. But they've been joined by Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims. They now have large, measurable communities across America. If you live in the cities, you see this. If you live in the countries, you don't yet. They haven't reached out to the countryside. But so while American Christianity now has a supermajority, they also have major competition from Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, even Sikhs, Taoists, etc., and all different kinds of religion. We've been attempting to try to figure out how does the new entheogenic religions fit on the American landscape. And there's two important considerations for doing that. One is that they have arrived just as America gained the supermajority of Christianity, and that's being expressed in all kinds of ways in terms of the public presence now of groups you've never heard of before in terms of the Christian community, such as the one that Speaker of the House and the head of the Department of Defense is a part of. But Christianity is fragmented beyond belief. I mean, it's hard to think of 1,500 denominations, and that the weakness of Christianity in affecting the culture is not so much from its size as it is from its fragmentation. So you've got everything in the Christian community, from the old Catholics to the Black Bumper Mennonites to the African American Methodists. Simultaneously with the fragmentation of Christianity, we began to recognize that an old and long-standing religious tradition existed in our midst that for a variety of reasons we have largely refused to acknowledge. Today we call that tradition Western esotericism. Esotericism is that tradition that grows out of ancient Gnosticism and was passed as a minority religious tradition through a variety of such groups, as I've just listed a few of them here, the more notable ones, particularly Neoplatonism, Manichaeanism, the Bogomils, the Cathars, Albigensians. After the Reformation and the 16th century Protestant Reformation, you get the birth of a new strand of esotericism. In the 17th century with Rosicrucianism. I should have added Freemasonry into here, but in the 19th century, of course, spiritualism, theosophy, Christian Science, New Thought, and today, more recently, the Wicca neo-paganism part of the strand. To understand esotericism, I found the best way to do it is to contrast it with religion. And when you hear the phrase spiritual, not religion, not religious, this is the group we're talking about. The esotericist is the physical group that has this label. You know, they're not an amorphous group out in the public. They are a very specific religious community that call themselves spiritual but not religious. And to contrast them with when they're talking about religion, they're not talking about religion as we define it in the academy when we teach our courses on comparative religion. They're talking about Christianity. They are not Christian, they are esotericist. They are not religious, they are spiritual. What does it mean? Well, Christians have a personal deity. Esotericists have an impersonal deity. In Christianity, that personal deity creates the material world. In esotericism, the God, the divine, emanates spirituality, and that spirituality comes into non-being, i.e. the material world. And so in Christianity, believers in the personal God organize as a church. The most common organization in esoteric groups is a school. Christians gather to worship. Esotericists gather to be educated in wisdom or gnosis. Christianity is led by clergy and pastors. Esoteric groups are led by teachers and facilitators. Humans in Christianity are the creation of God, as is the material world. Humans in esoteric traditions are a spark of the emanation of God, and they we should skip down to the state. For in Christianity, the problem of human existence is sin. God's good world has been warped, and we are caught in that warping. In esoteric groups, the problem is forgetfulness. The spark of God has been caught up in the non-being world of materialism and has forgotten its divine nature. So the purpose of Christianity is to save people from sin. The purpose in the esoteric groups is to find enlightenment, remember who you really are, that spark of the divine. And that's done with a set of spiritual disciplines. As Christians, we pray to our deity to be with us. There's no personal deity to pray to in esoteric groups, but they practice spiritual disciplines. And these spiritual disciplines allow them to attune to God. And they may include yoga, meditation, theurgy or magic, or they may involve the use of mind-altering substances. In Christianity, our attainment is a holy life. In esoteric groups, the attainment is wisdom. I say this because in investigating the statement of beliefs of the esoteric groups, I was startled, surprised to find 100 groups, most of whom did not know anyone else at the other groups, but all presenting a statement of belief that shared a very common esoteric worldview. Yesterday afternoon, we had a panel session with 6 members of different groups. I sat there. This time I wasn't amazed, but I was happy to confirm that all 6 of the groups, some of whom were meeting each other for the first time, found that they shared everything. There were no arguments among the groups because they were all operating out of the same one. One of the groups that I chose to highlight is Sacred Sanctuary. This is a group that's in litigation right now. Our purpose is to support and promote the transformation and evolution of human beings and the expansion of global consciousness by communing with the divine creator. In order to effectuate our purpose, we shall organize retreats and sacred ceremonies related to the expansion of consciousness and oneness with the universal life source. They don't really believe in the creator. There's no creation in Sacred Sanctuary's belief system. It's the universal life source. That's the real deity we have here. We believe our love and connection to all things is enhanced and better understood through the sacramental consumption of natural ethnogens. The spiritual discipline, which all of the groups share, while the exact substance may be different, is that they all take entheogenic substances as entheogenic substance, not ethnogenic, entheogenic substances as their spiritual discipline, and this is an essential part. As with Hindus, the practice of yoga is an essential part of religion. So with the entheogenic groups, the taking of the sacraments is the same. Full Circle Church of Cannabis, another group, they have called their religion relativism, a unique faith honoring each individual spiritual journey. That's an important characteristic of the entheocentric groups. 5 minutes. Whereas Christianity privileges the community, entheogenic churches privilege the individual. Yeah. Okay. Privileges the individual. This has several important correlations to it. Number one, in esoteric groups in general and in entheogenic groups in particular, the individual gets some real treatment. There's a focus upon them and upon their individual beliefs. At that level, there is no common faith, so to speak. Each individual develops their own theology and perspective. And there's a sense of real importance given to the individual. It also means that in a mass society such as we have, you lose, because we are a society of communities. And if you want to exercise political power, you have to have a communal grouping. So those religions that emphasize community have much more power, and those that do not, that emphasize the individual, remains relatively small and lack power. And that's an important consideration in what you're doing. If you want to see the consequences when an esoteric group begins to organize and get power, the other groups immediately complain that they are heretics and have lost the faith. The prime example in our day is Scientology, which is probably the second largest esoteric group in the country right now, but other such groups from Christian Science on down have experienced it over the years as they have attempted to grow. I offer these comments and the reflections on the several groups, and the third group, the Spirit of One, is an interesting group, and they have a very short statement that does a nice job of summarizing the whole bit. Get to my conclusion here. This little exercise is offered to manifest the type of spirituality expressed in the entheogenic religions, and to make the case that though they are very new religious expressions, they follow a millennial-old religious tradition that has shared space, however begrudgingly, with Christianity in the West. The task is especially relevant today as the entheogenic religions operate in a land dominated by Christianity, when they go up against the legal system, are most likely to be confronting officials who have either grown up as Christians or who understand the religiosity or lack thereof in the entheogenic groups based upon their experience with Christian churches. That the spiritual life of entheogenic groups looks so different from that of Christians can easily lead to its groups being dismissed as non-religious. It is all the more important in light of interest in esoteric groups in general within religious scholarly circles. So our task is, one, as religious scholars, is to become aware of esotericism and the tradition that they represent. There are more people following the esoteric traditions in America than Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and Jews combined. But they are in 400 different groups. So like Christianity right now, they're splintered to pieces. And if they're going to have a standing with the government and they're going to have a standing in hope of success in their legal cases looking for freedom of religion, they need to become aware of the larger community that stands behind them. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Our final presentation in this panel will be co-delivered by Fancy Sears, Tona Butler Truesdale, and Lisa Gazan. I will introduce them briefly as they're coming up to the podium. Fancy Sears is a licensed practicing counselor supervisor, licensed marriage and family therapist, national certified counselor, and a PhD student in anthropology at the University of Alabama. Reverend Tona Butler Truesdale is an attorney, chaplain, ritual assistant, head of the Allah Ase nonprofit, and an MA student in spirituality at Merrimack College. And Lisa Gazan is professor and chair of the anthropology department at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Welcome.
Thank you all. So our introduction to this topic comes from a basic question. Go ahead and move it forward. This? There, okay. Okay. What do psychedelic experiences mean for people within African diasporic communities of practice? We propose a people-first approach, one that decenters psychedelics as a self-evident analytic category and instead considers psychedelics alongside other kinds of altered states of consciousness experiences within holistic cultural contexts. We also take the very term psychedelics as a discursive formulation worth interrogating. We resist homogenizing broad cultural groups, not talking about the African diasporic experience, for example. And also we highlight the variable positioning of people within identifiable communities of practice.
So when we're thinking about psychedelics and the kaleidoscopic ways that communities within the African diaspora may use non-ordinary states for wellness or transformation, we want to make some important distinctions between African diasporic spiritual traditions and African diasporic communities, where African diasporic spiritual traditions are more formal and lineage-based and transmitted through initiation, and spiritual traditions such as Ifa, Candomblé, Santeria, or Hoodoo. African diasporic communities refer more broadly to a globally dispersed communities of people of African descent who remain connected through diffused cultural inheritance, shared ancestral histories, cultural memory, spiritual systems, or survival strategies. These individuals are historically typically rooted in Christian traditions, although they may or may not continue to still practice within those Christian traditions. And we're specifically talking about communities that are in the deep south of the US, and particularly in Alabama.
So when we take a people-first approach, we notice some trends. First, we see that there are some historically based cautions that shape reactions to psychedelics within those communities. On the one hand, legal prohibition and uneven enforcement of drug laws make people hesitant to talk about their experiences with these substances. Also, in many communities, there's an internal stigma about what's considered drug use that reinforces hesitation about using or embracing them as legitimate.
So when we think about, again, consciousness and the experiences that individuals have in diasporic communities, they are typically grounded in frameworks and spiritual frameworks, but they're also very deeply practical. As we build on Dr. Carl C. Bell's conceptualization of Black intrapsychic survival skills, in which he identified as culturally rooted ways and techniques for using altered or expanded states of consciousness to cope with stress, maintain harmony within communities, support problem solving, and preserve selfhood under extreme conditions of adversity. We also frame these uses or forms as generative disobedience, where their culturally rooted ways of knowing and healing are enacted outside of dominant systems in ways to help mitigate the embodied impacts of historical, intergenerational, and ongoing trauma within dominant biomedical systems. They're also used in other ways that may not necessarily use psychedelics. So some of the other forms in which individuals within these communities may engage in non-ordinary states may be through trance, possession, divination, sound, or even herbal treatments.
Our contention begins with a simple but consequential claim. Within African diaspora spiritual traditions, certain practices are unspeakable, but not because they are devoid of meaning, but because they are dense with meaning, sacred, guarded, embodied, historically vulnerable, and therefore not fully available to dominant terms through which modern institutions demand intelligibility. We use the word unspeakable in at least 3 senses. First, it names forms of sacred and esoteric knowledge that are not universally available. Such knowledge is often preserved within ritual lineages, communal disciplines, and structures of accountability. Its partial concealment is not evidence of incoherence. It is an ethical distinction between what may be publicly described and what must be or remain protected. Second, the unspeakable names practices shaped by histories of racial domination, displacement, displacement, criminalization, and surveillance. Across the Black Atlantic, communities have had strong reasons to veil certain forms of spiritual knowledge. Under such conditions, opacity is not confusion, it is strategy, it is protection. It is one of the ways a people keep soul and body together under pressure. Third, the unspeakable may be understood as a form of epistemic refusal, what we would also call generative disobedience. It resists the presumption that all valid forms of knowledge must become fully legible to be clinic, to the court, to the academy, or the market in order to count as real. In this sense, opacity is not anti-intellectual. It is a disciplined response to histories in which forced disclosure has too often enabled domination, extraction, and harm. Domination, extraction, and harm. This matters profoundly for psychedelic discourse. Within Black life, altered states of consciousness have not been merely curiosities, nor simply clinical phenomena. They have often functioned as intrapsychic survival skills. culturally grounded ways of using non-ordinary states of coherence, spiritual protection, discernment, grief work, problem solving, transformation in conditions of adversity.
So we note that systems of care suffer when culturally developed ways of surviving and healing are indecipherable to dominant biomedical frameworks.
So what we really want to kind of emphasize here is that culturally rooted ways of healing aren't just in opposition of biomedical mental health frameworks. In many cases, they may complement biomedical approaches by expanding what counts as valid pathways for regulation, meaning-making, stress reduction, and community support. At the same time, they may also complicate biomedical models because they challenge assumptions that healing must always be individualized, symptom-focused, or clinically legible. Practices grounded in ritual, prayer, embodied memory, or non-ordinary states of consciousness may not fit easily into dominant diagnostic frameworks, yet they may still produce meaningful outcomes. This is the space that gets created in what we call biocultural liberation, where healing is not only symptom relief, but it is the restoration of alignment between body, culture, consciousness, and community. So why does it matter in our sites of intervention? So in this preliminary study, we have a few questions that came up. And one is, how does this impact how we care for others? And are there gaps in practice and research? So in most clinical settings, cultural competence and cultural humility primarily focus on provider awareness. Whether clinicians, and that's basically whether clinicians know about cultural differences or have the ability to remain reflexive or avoid assumptions. While these models are very important, these models also pretty much kind of stop at provider knowledge or reflexivity. But what we do not fully yet address in these spaces is whether or not that care that's being offered actually aligns with how individuals and communities themselves understand their own healing. So the gap that we are understanding is not just simply in the knowledge of the difference, but it's also in a relational alignment gap between care, how that care is provided, the culture, and the actual lived meaning. So how do we study this in this preliminary study? In this preliminary study, this is really where cultural models and cultural consonants become especially useful for us. Rather than thinking about culture as a static provider knowledge, we're asking, what do communities themselves value as healing? How do individuals embody their cultural models in their own lives and experiences? And how do systems respond to these ways of knowing? Cultural consonance helps build the bridge between the individual and the community by examining whether the care aligns with what people actually know and embody and enact within their own cultural context. So this shift that we're proposing is from cultural competence as just awareness and reflexivity, but to cultural consonance as alignment with lived healing realities. And is it possible to have some kind of measurable outcome?
These practices belong to the labor of survival, the work of keeping dignity, memory, spirit, and community intact under impossible conditions. From the perspective of the humanities, African diaspora traditions remind us that the meaning is not exhausted by propositional language. Ritual, symbol, rhythm, music, trance, embodiment, dream, and ancestral mediation, meditation, all operate as forms of knowledge. What appears to be ineffable to modern discourse may, in fact, be highly ordered within another epistemic frame. From the perspective of religion, these traditions complicate the modern tendency to pathologize or privatize altered states. In many African diaspora cosmologies, non-ordinary states are not deviations from disciplined spiritual life. They may be prayerful, communal, morally interpreted, ritually bounded, and ethically consequential. So the relevant question is not merely whether consciousness has been altered, but by whom, within what cosmology, under what conditions of accountability, and toward what ends. From the perspective of law and policy, however, a serious tension emerges. Law tends to rely on disclosure, classification, evidence, and administrable categories. But what happens when the practice to be protected is intentionally partial in its self-revelation? What happens when recognition requires exposure? What happens when the very demand for legibility becomes another mode of intrusion? This is also where African diaspora traditions, spiritual traditions, both complement and complicate biomedical systems of care. They complement biomedical systems by widening our account of healing. They remind us that care is not only pharmaceutical or diagnostic. Care may also be communal, ritual, moral, spiritual, embodied, and ancestral. It may involve meaning-making, cleansing, song, silence, disciplined encounter, and restoration of the self in relation to community, spirit, and memory. But these traditions also complicate biomedical dominance because they refuse its monopoly over the definition of wellness. They ask whether all healing must be clinically translated to be legitimate. They ask who gets to define disorder, who gets to define efficacy, and whose cosmology sets the terms of validity. And they warn us that once sacred practices become newly valuable within psychedelic medicine, they are at risk of decontextualization, commodification, and racialized extraction.
So when this alignment is supported, especially within community, it creates conditions for what we call biocultural liberation. By this, we do not mean rejecting biomedical knowledge, but rather rebalancing authority, so that healing is not reduced only to symptom reduction, but instead healing emerges through the restoration of connection between body, culture, consciousness, and community. So our model suggests that when culturally rooted knowledge is embodied, enacted, and socially supported, people may experience not only relief, but a deeper restoration of meaning, agency, and belonging.
Okay, so tying it all together, our preliminary research suggests that people are using psychedelics in African diasporic communities and African diasporic spiritual traditions for a variety of intentions, including sacred. There are many kaleidoscopic and historically based ways of achieving non-ordinary states of consciousness within these traditions. And use of these substances may remain unspoken for a number of reasons. For research and for practical interventions, understanding holistic, cultural, social, and historic context is critical.
So, our central claim is this: the unspeakable is not a void in knowledge. It is a boundary, an ethic, and at times a method of survival. It is not outside care. It may, in fact, reveal forms of care that dominant systems have not yet learned how to honor without consuming. Say it again. It may, in fact, reveal forms of care that dominant systems have not yet learned how to honor without consuming. If psychedelic discourse is to be genuinely rigorous, humane, and just, it must do more than include African diaspora traditions as content. It must approach them as intellectual, ritual, and ethical worlds in their own right, with historical seriousness, interpretive humility, and accountability to the communities that have preserved them. Thank you.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu. Copyright 2026. The President and Fellows of Harvard College.